Good morning and happy Monday, second grade. Today we are finishing up our chapter 6 with 3-digit subtraction. Today we're focusing on regrouping with zeros. So the essential question for today is, how do you regroup when there are zeros in the number you start with? So that is what we are looking to solve today and figure out what we do when there are zeros in the number you start with. So let's start off with an example. We have 504 minus 392. We're going to do what we've been doing. When we do our subtraction, we're going to look at that top number and draw it into our chart over here. So, second grade, I want you to think about what number is in the ones place, and that's the number we are going to draw into our chart. So, we know that this is the ones place, so we're going to go ahead and draw 4 ones into our chart. We know that this is the tens place, and we don't have any tens, so this time we don't have to draw anything in our tens place. And we have 500s. So I'm going to go ahead and draw in 500s. So the next thing we do is look at this bottom number and see if we could start subtracting. So we're going to look over here in our chart. We are going to look in the ones place. We have 4 ones and we want to take away 2. We can do that, so we're going to go ahead and cross out 2 ones, leaving us with 2 ones. Next, we're going to look in the tens place. We have 0 tens in the tens place over here, and we want to take away 9. But we can't do that if we don't have any tens to take away. So, today we're going to be calling up the hundreds and asking to borrow tens, and we are going to bring them over into the tens place. So I'm going to go ahead and draw that in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So now we, of course, have to show what we just did over in our math problem. So we had 0 tens and we called up the hundreds and we asked to borrow 10 tens. That 500 then becomes a 400 and the 0 becomes 10 because we have 10 ones over here. So we're going to put a 10 up here. So then we could continue our subtraction. We have 10 tens now and we want to take away 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Oh, and this one down here, 10. So we have 1 left over. And then we have 4 hundreds, and we're going to take away 3. 1, 2, 3, leaving us with 112 as the difference. So, my friends, we were able to subtract from the ones, but then when we got to the tens, we couldn't do that just yet because we had to borrow from the hundreds. Because there were 0 tens, we took 10, and we moved them on over. So let's see if we can do that in another problem. This problem we have 302 minus 127. So, again, we're going to start with that top number and draw it into our chart over here. We have 2 ones. We have 0 tens and 3 hundreds. So we don't have to draw anything into that tens column. We're just going to draw 3 hundreds into the hundreds column. So then, we're going to go ahead and look at this bottom number and try to subtract those numbers from our chart. So we're going to start in the ones place. We have 2 ones and we want to take away 7. We know we can't do that because we just simply don't have enough ones. So what do? We call up the tens and we see if we can borrow some. But this time the 10 doesn't have any for us to borrow just yet. So the 10 actually has to call the hundreds and ask to borrow 10 before we can do anything else. So we take a 10 and we move it on over here and draw it into our chart. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So before we do anything else, let's show what we just did. We couldn't take 2 away from 7, so we called up the tens and asked to borrow some, but he didn't have any to give us. So then we had to borrow from the hundreds place. So the hundreds place gives the 10, 10. So the 100 becomes a 2, and the 0 then becomes 10, because we now have 10 tens over here. Now what we have to do is start in the ones place again, because this time we can call up the 10 and borrow 10, and we are able to then subtract. So I'm going to go ahead and draw that into here. And again, show that in our chart. So we had 10 tens now. We called up the 10 and asked to borrow some. So that becomes a 9. The ones actually becomes a 12, and then we can subtract. We have 12 ones and we take away 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That leaves us with 5. So now, my friends, we have 9 tens and we want to take away 2. 1, 2. That leaves us with 7 tens. And we have 2 hundreds, take away 1, leaving us with 175 as the difference. So this time we actually had to regroup twice in order to solve our problem. First we had to regroup in the tens place by calling up the hundreds, and then we had to regroup in the ones place by calling up the tens. So these steps were a little bit different than what we're used to because we had to regroup in the tens before we could regroup in the ones. So we're going to move on to another problem. We have 901 minus 573. So I'm going to go ahead and draw that into our chart over here really quick. We have 1, 1. We have 1, 1. We have 0 tens. And we have 9 hundreds. All right. Now we're going to look at this bottom number right here. We have 573. So again, we're going to look in our ones place, and we can't take away 3 if we only have 1. So we're going to call up the tens. Oh, we realized the 10 didn't have any, so the 10 is going to have to borrow some from the 100 before we can begin this whole subtraction. So we're going to move those on over. Those become 10 tens. Now let's not forget to show our work before we do anything else. So we borrowed from the tens place. It becomes 8. We borrow from the hundreds place, and then it becomes 8. And in the tens place, we now have 10 tens. So now we can continue on with our subtraction. So again, we're going to start back in the ones. We have to borrow from the tens place, so we're going to go ahead and cross out the 10. The 10 then becomes a 9, and we move these on over here. Making us have 11 tens, 11 ones. We had 1 and we added 10. And now second grade, do we agree that we can just finish out our subtraction from here? We have enough in the top to take from the bottom. I agree. So we have 11 and we're going to take away 3. 1, 2, 3, leaving us with 8. Oops. We have 9 and we're going to take away 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That leaves us with 2 tens. And we had 8 hundreds and we're going to take away 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That leaves us with 328 as our difference. So here's another example. I'm doing a couple examples today. If you feel like you're comfortable with this, you can certainly move on to our math. But if not, stay with me and we'll do a couple more examples together. So we have 405 minus 139. I'm going to look at this top number, quickly draw it into my chart over here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 0 tens and 4 hundreds. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to look at that bottom number and I'm going to try and take 5 away in the ones place. I can't do that, so I got to move over to the tens and see if he has any. And since the 10 doesn't have any, he's got to call his friend the 100 and see if we could borrow 10 tens. So then we are going to draw that into our chart and make sure we show it what we just did. So we tried to subtract the ones. We couldn't do that, so we called the tens. The tens didn't have any, so he had to call his friend the hundreds and borrow 10. The hundreds place becomes a 3. The tens place it becomes 10. And now we can go back to the ones place and try and regroup again. So we're going to call up the tens, move 10 on over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We called up the 10 and borrowed 10, so that becomes a 9. This becomes a 15, and then we can do our subtraction. So we have 15 minus 9. We're going to cross out 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That leaves us with 6. We have 9 tens, and we want to take away 3. 1, 2, 3. That leaves us with 6. And we had 3 hundreds, and we just take away 1, leaving us with 266 as the difference. So let's try this example together. We have 405 minus 277. This time we're not actually going to write it in, but we're just going to try and follow the steps that I wrote next to it. So we're going to look in the ones place. There are more on the floor, which means there are more on the bottom, so we can't subtract, and we have to call next door. When we call next door to the tens place, he doesn't have any, so we actually have to call the hundreds to borrow. We're going to then regroup, so the hundreds becomes a 3 and the tens becomes a 10. Now, my friends, we go back to the ones place and we call up the tens to borrow some. That becomes a 9. This becomes a 15. And then we can subtract. So we have 15 minus 7, which is 8. And then we have 9 minus 7, which is 2. And 3 minus 2, which is 1. So we looked in the tens place. There was more on the floor, so we called next door. The 10 was 0, so we had to call the hundreds. So we followed these steps to try and subtract this answer, and we got the correct answer. So let's try another example. This will be our last example before we try a word problem together. So we have 504 minus 187. My friends, what I look at first is that ones place and see if I can subtract. I can't subtract, so I call up the tens place. The tens place. The 10 doesn't have any, so he calls up the 100 and starts to regroup. The 5 becomes a 4. The 0 becomes a 10, and now we are ready to begin our subtraction by starting in the ones, calling up the tens, borrowing 10. The 4 becomes a 14, making this 14 minus 7 is 7. 9 minus 8 is 1, and 4 minus 1 is 3, making the difference 317. So let's try this word problem together. Jack has 175 more Beyblades than Carl. Jack has 302 Beyblades. How many Beyblades does Carl have? So they told us that Jack has 175 more Beyblades than Carl, and the amount of Beyblades that Jack has is 302. To find out how many Carl has, we have to subtract these two numbers, because they told us that Jack had 302. Remember, that bigger number always goes on top. And they said that Jack had 175 more than Carl, which means that Carl had 175 less than Jack. So we're going to go ahead and do that subtraction. Start in that ones place, we have 2 minus 5. We can't do it, so we got to call up the tens. He doesn't have any for us to borrow, so he's got to go to the hundreds place, and we can regroup then. That becomes a 10, and then we can start in the ones place and call up the tens again. He has some to borrow this time, so he becomes a 9. This becomes 12 minus 5. 12 minus 5 is 7. 9 minus 7 is 2, and 2 minus 1 is 1, making the difference 127. What this means is that Carl has 127 Beyblades. My friends, today you are going to do page 447, numbers 4 through 13. Today I'm going to ask that if you possibly can, if you or your parent can take a picture of page 447 and upload it to our Google Classroom, just so I can check and make sure you guys are on the same page as us, and make sure before we move on we all understand. That is all for today. Have a fantastic Monday, and I will see you tomorrow.